All right, welcome back to Ecology. I took a little bit of time off, so it's actually been a while since the last lecture. I think the last thing we were covering was facilitated succession. The idea that some group of pioneer species alter the environment in such a way that we promote the development of a second seer, which is composed of a group of species very different from this initial group of pioneer species. Seer B contains species that pave the way for a group of species in Seer C, and we follow this development of community structure in a very regular and orderly fashion, though it may take decades or 100 years. And eventually we reach the point where we have a group of species here, or in some cases maybe even a single species. You could make a decent argument in forested areas in Pennsylvania that eastern hemlock is the climax species, but in other areas white pine is in the mix, so you could have a group of climax species. And then once we're here, we get stuck in this seer and can't get out of it because Seer E contains this climax species that are self-renewing. Okay, and I think we did an application of this in terms of digestive system. There are certainly other examples I'll cover here in a little bit. But I want to make the point that the way facilitated succession works is if we were to do anything to disrupt the community structure as it currently exists, all we're really doing is resetting the clock, and eventually the community will progress back to where it was. So for example, if I went in and logged all of the hemlock and white pine, I am resetting the clock back to a previous seer, and my hardwoods might still be there, and they would carry me forward through to the climax group of species as long as there was a source of colonists, right? I need seeds for eastern hemlock and white pine, but as long as I have those, I would progress orderly from D to E. Or I could come in and clear out all of the trees, or I could go in and log the area, and then I would reset back to an initial group of herbaceous species, and then they would promote the growth of the shrubs, which promote the growth of more trees, and we move from the soft to the hardwoods, and finally to the climax species. I could come in here and periodically have fire erupt, and depending on the severity of the fire, reset the successional clock, and then the facilitated model predicts that we would progress right back to that climax group of species given enough time. Okay? Now, a couple other things about this model. Because we started here with the old field, because we were doing old field succession, because we started with this old field, we started with an environment that already had soil in existence, right? That farm field has pretty good soil in it, and all we need to do is add seeds, and we get that initial group of pioneer species moving in. If you start with existing soil, the model that you're working with is called secondary succession. So the facilitated succession model has built into it a couple of different approaches. The first one's referred to as secondary succession. Well, it didn't take people long after they'd worked with these old fields to realize that you don't always start out plant communities with existing soil. You could start them out, in fact, with no soil, in which case we could start with bedrock material, Or if we had a volcanic eruption, we could start out with lava turning into that, trying to think of that, magma turns into that kind of igneous rock. I can't think of the name of it, but that very porous kind of igneous rock that shows up initially. In any case, if I start with bedrock, I'm not starting with soil. And if we start with bedrock instead of soil, then we're going to build what's referred to as the primary succession model. The primary succession model covers the beginning of that soil formation and then picks up where secondary succession occurs, and then we would move right along. So I guess my point is, if we're talking primary succession, we're going to talk about the pieces that precede the secondary succession model. Okay? So what we're really looking at doing over the long term is converting bedrock material into soil. Once we have the soil, we then follow the model that we've already talked about. Okay? All right, so how do we convert bedrock material to soil? Well, not easy to do, obviously. But the idea is, if I have this bedrock and it's exposed to the elements, the rock is not perfectly flat, it's not level. I suspect that there are going to be these nooks and crannies that exist within this rock. So the first part of this primary succession has to do with the activity of the water itself. So I'm just going to reset here, give myself a little bit of extra space to work in. So here's my bedrock material, and I've got these little nooks and crannies where water is beginning to settle. Okay? Now, once I have this water in place, I do, as a consequence of this, get microorganisms that can now exist here. I mean, obviously microorganisms can exist outside of the water as well. They just have to have a source of water, maybe some periodic rain or whatever, maybe it's humid. So it's easier to talk about it here. I have all these microorganisms that are living in this water. That would be bacteria, some fungi, and some algae. Those are the ones we might think about initially. Okay, how did they get there? Well, they colonized through the air. All of these are very good at moving through the air and arriving through dispersal at this new location. Now, the source of water means that these organisms can do hydrolysis, because you need water to do hydrolysis. The source of water means that they have a source of water for cells to keep proteins in the proper shape, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so these organisms are beginning to do their thing, right? The algae are using sunlight and water to manufacture organic molecules. We have some saprophytic organisms that are coming in and consuming any of the dead stuff. When these algal cells die, they can consume the dead stuff, so could the bacteria. So we have this nice little community that's begun to develop around these photosynthesizers. Now, I would expect detritus and all sorts of other material to arrive in this little puddle of water, leaves, right, decomposing material from organisms elsewhere. Okay? All right, now, as these organisms do their thing, the bacteria, I would expect most of these to be aerobic bacteria. Fungi are certainly aerobic. They do cellular respiration as eukaryotes. And the algae, in addition to doing photosynthesis, are also doing cellular respiration. So once you start doing this cellular respiration trick, 2O plus, oops, I'll go back to MCV. Once you start doing cellular respiration, you're getting the production of carbon dioxide and water as a waste product. And then from your other classes, you should be comfortable with this. That is, water and CO2 in a dynamic equilibrium form this molecule. If you were here, I'd be quizzing everybody to make sure that they're comfortable with these molecules because they show up again and again and again. When you do human phys, if you take that, you're going to be talking a lot about bicarbonate buffering systems within blood serum. Carbonic acid is formed. It disassociates very quickly. It's one of those acids that tends to fall apart very quickly to form a hydrogen ion. And this stuff, which is bicarbonate. Now, if we were doing blood buffering systems, we would stop here, but we're not. We're doing what's taking place out there in the real world, in which case this dynamic equilibrium can continue all the way to the formation of carbonate. Okay? I never quite understood why this is bicarbonate because I can't find the 2 here. I see a 2 there, but it's not called bicarbonate, it's called carbonate. So, typical biology. All right, so as soon as the CO2 and water are formed, we get carbonic acid, which leads to bicarbonate formation and carbonate. And the trick here is the production of these, which is causing a change in pH in this little aquatic system that we've developed. The hydrogen ions have the ability to begin to etch the rock. After all, the rock itself is just a series of atoms held together mainly through ionic bonds. If you think about something like limestone, calcium carbonate, right? Those are ionic bonds holding the carbonate to the calcium. The hydrogen ions, along with the water, help facilitate the breakdown or disassociation of these ions. So as this system progresses, we're beginning to etch the rock, break it down, release more ions from the rock, and we're beginning to etch into this rock these kind of little grooves at the microscopic level. Okay? As we continue to etch, these grooves become larger and larger and larger. Now, these little pockets here are kind of important, in part because if we live in a part of the world like where we are, we get this periodic freezing, right? So water can get into those, and then in the wintertime, we get freezing in those little nooks and crannies, right, those little grooves, and as ice forms here, ice expands, right? The water gets cold, 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 it gets to 4 degrees Celsius, it's the most dense, and then as we freeze, water expands, and this expansion pushes against the walls of that groove, and we get probably the chipping off of little pieces of rock much larger than these microscopic pieces that are being released through the etching. But now we've got the release of lots and lots of these little chips through freezing of water, the breaking apart of these grooves. Okay? Now, if this formation was in the spring, and then by the summertime this had all kind of dried out, right? Our little bacterial community might not be quite what it was before. We have these little etches in there. But because it's a depression, we could get the collection of a bunch of organic material. This collection of organic material is important because it's basically rudimentary soil. I've got organic material, that's the humus that's found within the soil. I never know if it's humus or humus. I think humus is 2 M's, so I think that's humus. And then since we have these ions that are a part of the bedrock material, we should have a source of ions too, as long as water is available. So if we get enough water here, then we get a seed from some plant arriving here. The plant will then put its roots out into this organic material, use whatever is being broken down by the soil bacteria and fungi that happen to be there, and then this plant begins to grow. Let's enlarge this again. as that plant begins to grow here, it puts its roots down into here. Over time, the roots get larger and larger in diameter, particularly for plants that are capable of what's called secondary growth. That is, they're wood formers, like trees or shrubs. As they grow in here, these roots get larger and larger, and you can imagine with the expansion in the size of these roots, I get a little bit of pressure that begins to form in these cracks. This pressure is being generated by water that's in these tissues, and therefore it's what's called hydraulic pressure. This pressure that water exerts due to moving in through osmosis is actually fairly strong. Let me give you a little example here. When I was in school, one of the big mysteries was the Egyptian pyramids. We know that they were in the Bronze Age, so they had bronze tools, but bronze does not cut rock very well. I mean, it can barely get through armor. So with bronze tools, the issue is how the heck do you even cut through these large pieces of rock in such a straight and orderly way? There was a botanist that did a few demonstrations to show how this might have been done. And that is, you have your large stone here, like this, and you want smaller stones out of it. What you could do is let's do it this way, is cut a little groove in it, right, a little tiny groove with your bronze tool just by like dragging it across the surface. Then what you do is you put a bunch of seeds in here, and then over the top they would put wet mud. The seeds, through hydraulic pressure, soak up the water from the mud, and the seeds then expand under this hydraulic pressure. And as they expand, collectively they exert this pressure on this groove and force it apart. And as they force it apart, they drive the groove down deeper into this rock. And then you put new seeds down here, more mud over the top. They expand, and you get this crack beginning to develop down through